Hi, everybody. Welcome to the newest episode. I guess it's always going to be the newest episode of the High Desert Podcast. Ben's back with us. He was gone earlier this week when we filmed our episode with Mary, so we're always glad to have him back. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Dr. Sam White, professor of history, correct, at OSU?
That's correct. At
Ohio State University. He's joining us via Skype, so please excuse any delay or gargliness with the audio. And we're going to ask him, he's an expert on domestication of, now domesticated species, livestock species. We're going to be asking him about those as well as companion pets, which is obviously our focus of this podcast. So thank you so much, Dr. White, for joining us.
So, Dr. White,
thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I was just really curious about how you really got into this field and what prompted you to really look at domesticated animals.
All right. So I'm a professor of environmental history and teach a number of topics in environmental history. And when I came to join the faculty at Oberlin College, where I taught for 5 years before coming to Ohio State, I was looking for topics that would attract a wide range of students in history and environmental studies. Topics that students could really relate to, but which also had real consequence, real impact, and also provided interesting avenues for me to explore topics of research. Animals was certainly one of those. And what's interesting is that it's something that historians at the time were really just starting to get interested in. It's one of those topics that, of course, is everywhere if you look at the historical record, especially if you're looking back at pre-industrial history, and most people are living in the countryside, most people are living with domesticated animals, but which is remarkably overlooked until relatively recently, when historians were looking for new topics, new ways to understand people's day-to-day life and the wider relationships they had with the environment.
So do you think that's really, is really accurate what you're saying about how people just recently have started getting into about these animals that have been with us for so many centuries? What about them? How did that happen? And do you think it's because of our relationship that has changed with animals that people really started looking at them in a different way?
Yes, I think it's certainly related to the way in which animals, our pets in particular, have become such an important part of our everyday lives. And perhaps because we are so removed from most domesticated animals, which are livestock, we feel the need to actually think about them again, to go out and look for real information, try to understand what happened to them, what's the situation that we're in now. I think it's also related to a rising interest in history of food as well. As people start to think more about problems of diets, the obesity epidemic, and so forth, people are also starting to look at, where does our food come from? And that inevitably takes us to the question of, where do the animals come from that we eat, and what is our relationship with them?
That's a really good point.
So we wanted to kind of provide some historical context here, and I know that this is all being done through, or we're divining these relationships through an archaeological and sometimes even fossil record. I think fossil record. I don't know if that our relationship with animals goes back that far even. But do we have an idea of what the first species that we can consider to be domesticated by humans was?
Almost certainly dogs.
Okay.
And it seems that every other species was not domesticated until after the rise of settled village life and agriculture. So not until after the end of the last ice age, people started settling down, started raising domesticated plants. And it seems that once that happened, we brought in many other new domesticates, both livestock and also cats, it appears. But dogs were almost certainly domesticated during the last ice age, so before people started to settle down, before the rise of agriculture. And that makes their domestication especially interesting.
So as early as a hunter-gatherer phase of humanity.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And that domestication of dogs, do we know where that took place, or if it took place in multiple places around the world?
So there's still a number of theories going on about that. And I think you would get different answers talking to different experts depending on where they're working and what kind of material they work on. There are those who would still opt for an origin in somewhere in the Middle East, where most of our first domesticated animals and many of our first domesticated plants come from. Others who would point to Europe, still others who would point to parts of Asia. And there's also still a lot of debate about whether there was one domestication or many. And that's because it seems almost certainly the case that early domesticated dogs would still have interbred with wild populations here and there. And so from the genetic record, that would make it more difficult to establish whether there was one population or many first domesticated. It's a rapidly evolving field. So I'm hesitant to voice one judgment right now because that could all soon change.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying so that it's a difficult relationship to determine because of admixture with other, and admixture we're talking about, I guess, species that can interbreed with dogs with other, presumably like precursors to wolves or coyotes or something like that.
Well, yes, to wolves, I guess, to dogs that were non or incompletely domesticated. So that's not uncommon among other animals. For instance, with pigs, what we consider domesticated pigs in Europe did continue periodically to interbreed with wild boars until quite recently, in many cases until the last 2 or 3 centuries. So that can complicate trying to identify one specific population that was first domesticated.
Okay, let's go off on that tangent of pigs a little bit because that's the main seems to be the main subject or main I guess pigs are of multiple species, I believe, right? Is that unlike dogs?
Some would classify them as multiple subspecies, and of course there are multiple suid species, including species such as the peccary that aren't domesticated, with the javelina in the southwest. But our domesticated pigs all come from one species, from Sus scrofa, or Sus scrofa domesticus, to indicate the domesticated variety of those.
Okay, yeah, we're interested because obviously there are people around the world, and certainly in the United States, who keep pigs as pets,
Right.
potbelly pigs.
It's true. It's true.
And,
they're not the best pets in the world, but they can be very affectionate to some people.
They're supposed to be affectionate and very intelligent. How was that intelligence or their physiology in any way affected by our domestication of them?
That's a difficult question. So domestication doesn't usually directly relate to an animal's intelligence, but very often when we're selecting, well, not necessarily deliberately selecting for traits, but perhaps accidentally selecting for traits such as tameness, we have also, in the process of domestication, selected for traits that involve carrying over juvenile or childlike characteristics of an animal into its adulthood. It's a process, I should say, called neoteny. And that actually explains a lot about the difference between domesticated and wild animals. It helps explain why they're more tame. It also helps explain certain physical features, such as the tendency to have spots on the forehead, to have shorter snouts, to have curly tails in some species, and so forth. So a lot of what we think of as being domesticated traits of animals are traits that are essentially childlike traits carried over into adulthood. And that can affect behavior in some ways, and possibly intelligence. Although when we say, it's hard to say an animal is more or less intelligent in that respect. It's really a more complicated picture. In fact, if I can go on a tangent, it's actually dogs the most interesting case with that. We know, for instance, that dogs have perhaps the best ability among any animals to read our intentions. For instance, dogs can understand that when you're pointing to something that you want them to look at or pay attention to what you're pointing at rather than your finger. If you try it with a cat, or actually just about any other animal, including even intelligent ones like chimpanzees, they'll probably look at your finger. It seems to be the case that both juvenile dogs and juvenile wolves have this fairly good ability to read human intentions, but that with wild wolves, they lose a lot of that ability as they age. Whereas with domesticated dogs, they retain it through adulthood. So this is also a case of neoteny, where it might actually make the animal seem, in some respects, more intelligent. Although really what it should be seen as is a retention of a juvenile characteristic.
I don't even know where to start with that. That is one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard.
That's a good perspective. The idea of dogs being able to pick up your intention and where you're pointing is well documented, and you know we know about that. But the idea that it's a reflection of their juvenile status or just the whole idea of a younger animal. It's an interesting direction to go.
Yeah, and so these, especially the physical traits that we, I guess, try to encourage or perpetuate into adulthood. The reason behind that is aesthetic or behavioral, and
it's difficult to say because these are traits that could emerge accidentally as we're selecting for completely different behaviors or traits. So there's a famous experiment by the Russian scientist Dmitry Belyaev that was conducted starting in the mid-20th century and actually has continued in some respects all the way up into the 21st century, in which he bred captive foxes that were captured and kept for their furs, only based on their relative tameness towards people, their willingness to be handled by people, not to by people, as I understand the experiment. And over a number of generations, it took several dozen generations, he was able to produce foxes that were not only incredibly tame, in fact, really pet-like, but also showed a number of physical characteristics that resemble those we expect in domesticated dogs, such as piebald coloring or a spot on the forehead, an underbite, a shortened snout, a curly tail. He wasn't deliberately selecting for all those physical characteristics. He was, as I understand the experiment, only selecting for tameness, but those others came about by accident as linked traits, as part of this whole package of neoteny, of retaining juvenile characteristics into adulthood.
That study is very fascinating, and I was curious about where you think that domestication actually starts or comes from in these animals. I mean, how does it begin? I mean, there's a lot of theories about it, but where do you think you can go back? Where does it come from?
And more recently, sorry to interrupt either of you, but they've some scholars have put forward kind of this hypothesis that dogs may have kind of ingratiated themselves. It's not really a situation in which we captured them and tamed them, but our, I guess, proximity, and opportunism allowed for us to kind of coexist and become closer over time.
Those are excellent questions, and I think that gets to the heart of a lot of the research about domestication. There, I think, have been a lot of assumptions often going into research in domestication, especially that used to, if you were to look at older research decades ago, about the usefulness of domesticated animals, and about the intentionality that people might have had towards domesticating animals. Really, the assumption that humans were doing this deliberately because animals were going to work for them, they're going to be useful for them. I think what has changed is that now we can increasingly see humans as being a factor in the animal's environment. And we can see domestication as in part a adaptive strategy of animals to this new environmental factor. Sort of the classic case, and again, this is largely just supposition, is the domestication of cats. The idea being that cats were probably never seen as these useful animals that people intentionally went out to domesticate, but rather cats themselves saw the opportunity to live around human settlements, to catch the rodents that might have been attracted to human waste or to stored human grain. And in that process, only the tamest ones, only the ones that were most willing to live around people, reproduce around people, managed to survive and succeed from an evolutionary perspective. And therefore, we ended up with a variety of animal that was more tame, that was essentially domesticated, eventually became pets. And that same idea, I think, could probably work for a number of other animals, possibly including dogs. I think we'll learn more about this as research into domestication improves. It's already moved just in leaps and bounds over the last couple decades as genetic evidence has come to supplement archaeological evidence. So we can not just see physical changes, but now increasingly extract genetic material from old samples. And then in some cases, although this is far outside my area of expertise, people are trying to look at that genetic material and identify what changes that we see and what kinds of physical behavioral characteristics might be associated with those genetic changes. So one example that has actually come out of research on dog domestication, as I understand it, is that dogs seem to be more capable than wolves of digesting carbohydrates. This may have been an actual selective factor in the domestication of dogs. That would strongly suggest dogs eating our waste as opposed to just going out there and being sort of hunting companions with us, or an animal that was actually domesticated for the purpose of hunting. That doesn't necessarily exclude the possibility that dogs were seen as useful because they helped hunt, but it also suggests that they may have seen opportunities in scavenging around human settlements, much like many village dogs continue to do into the 21st century.
I love that example. I just was curious about whether feral dogs or wolves would eat carbohydrates like bread or anything like that. Do you know if they do? Because I know that when I visit Mexico and you try to give wild dogs tortillas, they just don't want them. So
I'm not sure. I could say anecdotally, I've known dogs that have loved things like bagels, but
domesticated dogs.
Who doesn't love a
Yeah,
good bagel,
domesticated.
really?
Yeah.
Jewish dogs, like my dogs.
And I think certainly we might end up seeing selection for that increasingly in the among other wild canid population. For instance, I would expect that we'll start to see strong selective pressure for that even among, say, coyotes. As we get larger urban coyote populations and as they rely increasingly on scavenging our trash, there probably is a selective process underway for those animals that can best manage to digest whatever we have as waste. And so I think that just goes to show that we can imagine similar scenarios in the past. Although now, of course, our environmental footprint is so much greater, we could be selecting for such traits at an even faster rate.
Is tameness? It sounds like universally the trait, the priority in terms of traits selected for when humans domesticate a species.
I would think so. It's not impossible, of course, that people did deliberately select for other traits, and tameness somehow came about as a result. But it seems less likely. It seems that tameness is often the first thing that you would need in order to domesticate an animal. I can think of one possible exception, though, and that could actually be the chicken. This might sound odd, but if you were to look at the jungle fowl that the chicken is domesticated from, it's not necessarily an obvious great candidate for providing us with meat and eggs. What is interesting about the jungle fowl, which the chicken comes from, is that male roosters, I should say, will fight each other. And it's not inconceivable that they were actually first domesticated for the purpose of cockfighting. In fact, many of our modern breeds actually came from chickens that were bred in order to have roosters involved in cockfighting. So that could be an odd exception there, and it's a reminder that what we assume animals are for, whether it's for meat or milk or wool in the case of sheep, it might not have been what they were originally domesticated for.
Very, very good point. Very interesting.
And then this may seem like a very basic question at this point in the conversation, but how would we actually define domestication? I mean, are there animals that we have I think of especially animals like raptors that we use for falconry. Can we really say that those animals are domesticated? How do we define that word?
It's a really tough word to define. In fact, when I teach my course on animals and in human history, I often start by getting students to try to come up with a definition. And there are a number, I think, of sort of conventional social definitions, including, for instance, naming, the value that we place on them, whether they're considered property or not. But then I think the way it's most often used in the study of domestication is as some sort of particular genetic trait. I mean, as something that has to be genetically selected for and is therefore inheritable, as opposed to just simply tameness. You can tame a wild animal and maybe have it live in your house, but it doesn't make it domestic, right. Because its offspring wouldn't necessarily be tame as well. So it does seem to be, at least in the way that most people working in the field would use it, something about its genetic change, and usually one associated with tameness, or at least to an adaptation towards living with people. At that point, though, of course, it becomes more difficult to separate domesticated animals from, say, animals that have simply done a good job living in human settlements, like rats or pigeons, which arguably are feral animals, because many of them do come from populations that were originally bred by pigeon fanciers for certain traits. So the line can become quite blurry.
Yeah, so definitely domestication is something that maybe you're not something that you could do with individual animals, but something of a breed over generations of time, sort of like dogs and cats, and then now pigs, right? So
and foxes,
yes,
and that, yeah.
And so, what is your research really? How does that help for today's animals as we're going forward into it? Does it give you a different perspective on animals? Do you think, I'm putting it on a limb there about whether you feel that this kind of research that's been doing helped it improve the relationship with animals, with people, or where does it go?
On the one hand, some of my research, especially research in pigs, was really driven by an effort to understand history on its own terms, as opposed to just think about what does it tell us about modern pigs. On the other hand, I do also believe that we do need to think about domestication differently, perhaps in order to have more sympathy for our domesticated animals. If we still think about domestication as something that was deliberate, something that was purposeful, that we did to and for animals to make them useful, it could imply that that gives us certain rights over the way they live now, and that they're supposed to serve a certain role. I think by looking at the longer history of domestication, by all those questions about intentionality and whether it was, as it were, something we chose or whether it's something that the animal adapted for, can get us to rethink that assumption that they're here to serve us. So in that regard, yes, I think there could be a connection between the history of domestication and our views towards our humaneness towards animals in the present.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually probably a good point to leave on, is what the future of how these studies inform our understanding and our relationships with these animals in the future.
Certainly, I just feel your research is kind of reflecting, what the societal changes. And when we look at that, and then we can take a look back, why is society changing? Why is it changing their attitudes on animals? And then who knows where it would actually lead to? And definitely, we are always looking for the improvement relationship with the animals, and maybe we can even start understanding to these wild animals, or even all animals, need to be protected in some way because we are dominion of their land, right? So,
and not to mention that kind of this introduction of agency. So the idea that animals had some sort of agency or choice in being close to us has a lot of indications about animal welfare.
It really does.
I think, right? That these are not just slaves of another species, so to speak, that these are animals who may have ingratiated themselves into our lives, especially, it seems, in the case of cats and dogs and other pets.
Not much you can comment on that.
I'm sorry. More of a statement than a question.
You can chime in at any time.
But we do want to thank you for being on. I think, again, you've opened a whole can of worms about stuff that we're going to think about now, and we're probably going to have you on again. So sorry for roping you into a long-term.
We'll have some more questions for you.
We'll have different follow-up questions.
But can I ask you, Dr. White, a personal question? Do you have a companion, animal companion of your own?
I have a cat, yes.
Aha, you're a cat person. Very good. And do you see those, there's a whole theory about cats, if they really probably could kill you if they wanted to.
If they were bigger.
If they were bigger?
Yes.
Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, that's probably the case.
Do you think your cat really loves you, or he tolerates you being around because you give him food and warmth? Or she?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't want to anthropomorphize animals.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Insofar in their own way that they feel affection for others. I think, yes, a cat feels as much affection for me as it could or would for any other living creature. Whether we should call that love is another question, because I don't want to assume it's the same kind of feelings that
definitely it's a different
we
species.
have as people.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you being on and chatting with us and informing us about your research and things we can look forward to as the world changes.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been incredibly fascinating, and I think we're going to have a lot of other conversations like this, because I don't know that people think of this on a daily basis, where these animals, who are mostly sharp-toothed carnivores that live in their homes, where they come from and what their history is with us, and that it goes back millennia. So thank you so much for being on, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
So thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of
High Desert Podcast.
That's the name of it. It's not like we made up that name already.
P-A-W-E-D.
P-A-W-E-D. Cast.
XYZ. Cast.
If you have any other questions, I'm sure you're going to have questions after that, and we're going to do our best to get Dr. White on again. Please write us an email at podcast, spelled the way we just butchered,
P-A-W-E-D.
C-A-S-T, at sfhumanesociety.org. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good week.
Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.